COVID-19 remains a global health emergency, and I agree.
A rubber dinghy packed with African migrants reaching the shore of Zahara de los Atunes in broad daylight.
Why should this happen to people? Why should people die on the Mediterranean? Why should they die at borders? Why does border exist?
The battle along the front lines in eastern Ukraine is intensifying as Russian forces step up artillery attacks in the region.
Ya fue derribado un globo que fue hallado en el espacio aéreo estadounidense identificado como chino. La relación entre las dos potencias se sigue tensando.
We must not allow the world fall into another Cold War.
The desire to dominate the 5G industry and kill the prospects of your rival.
Inflation is dominating headlines in every corner of the globe. Now, from the Americas to Europe to Asia and Africa, prices of essential commodities, they continue to rise across the world.
193 millones de personas no tienen suficiente para comer cada día.
En la cumbre de Bali de 2022, el G20 abordó una situación de una complejidad sin precedentes desde su creación en 1999. Justo cuando el mundo salía de la pandemia, llegó la guerra en Ucrania, el aumento de los precios de los alimentos, el aumento de los precios de la energía, la consiguiente inseguridad alimentaria y, por si fuera poco, un evidente agravamiento de la crisis climática. Durante los innumerables diálogos y reuniones ministeriales que precedieron a la cumbre de Bali, costó encontrar en el G20 una visión común sobre los desafíos globales actuales, en particular por los desacuerdos sobre la situación en Ucrania. Muchos dudan de la capacidad del G20 para articular una mirada común ante los inmensos desafíos globales que tiene frente a sí, en un mundo de creciente fragmentación, de rivalidades geopolíticas, de crisis superpuestas. Policrisis. Es que el mundo se está volviendo más conflictivo, más fragmentado, menos cooperativo, más incierto. Navegamos en aguas más turbulentas que nunca. Frente a ello, ¿continuará este foro siendo relevante para dar respuesta a los múltiples desafíos globales? ¿O se sumergirá en la irrelevancia hasta su disolución? ¿Qué papel deben jugar los países emergentes en esta coyuntura internacional?
A veces pasamos por alto que el G20 ha sido uno de los acontecimientos más importantes para la gobernanza económica mundial en las últimas décadas. De hecho, la incorporación de las economías emergentes y en desarrollo en las decisiones sobre los principales asuntos globales es hoy una realidad tangible. El G20 ha evolucionado a lo largo de los años de acuerdo con las preocupaciones y prioridades cambiantes de los líderes en temas de gobernanza global, desde las finanzas y las organizaciones internacionales hasta la mitigación del cambio climático. El advenimiento del G20 fue un paso hacia un mundo más plural, la coexistencia de diferentes civilizaciones, una mayor tolerancia a la diversidad, una voluntad de superación de las frustraciones en la búsqueda de consensos sobre diversos temas que surgían en un mundo global e interdependiente.
We should start with the inception itself. The G20 had been established primarily to address challenges to international financial stability by the widening crisis in emerging economies in the late 90s. Considering the global impact of the crisis, the G20 recognized that this discussion needed to involve both advanced and emerging economies in order to make the international economic system more representative.
G20 emerged from the global financial crisis. Back then, EMEs and developed members embarked on the journey of macroeconomic policy coordination. Together, we saved the world economy from depression.
At the same time, a forum like the G20 is still defined in terms of a small group of countries. It doesn't seek to preempt or to overrule what happens at multilateral fora like the United Nations, but it enables those key economies to really get together and focus on global economic cooperation.
La primera cumbre de líderes del G20 fue convocada por el entonces presidente de los Estados Unidos, George Bush, en noviembre de 2008, para hacer frente a la crisis financiera mundial. Desde su primera reunión en Washington en 2008, este foro fue concebido como un espacio de cooperación internacional con el propósito de promover el crecimiento económico y reformar los sistemas financieros en busca de una mejor calidad de vida.
Developing countries are important sources of current and future supply and demand. They represent the market, promoting their integration into the global economy as a path of their prosperity is not just a moral obligation, it is absolutely essential for a sustainable and balanced growth of the global economy. That is the key. The emerging markets hold the key to the future, and therefore they need to play a very critical, a very crucial and a significant role in G20.
The G20 has evolved to become one of the most strategic international fora of global cooperation for developed and developing countries. We contribute permanently to shaping solutions to present and future systemic crises. The institutionalization of the G20 in 2008 at the leaders level was a clear recognition of the increasing economic and political relevance of emerging countries in the global economy.
El mundo ha cambiado enormemente desde entonces, y hoy los países emergentes están en posición de representar los intereses y aspiraciones del sur global y ayudar a encontrar soluciones a los problemas que afectan profundamente a los habitantes de este planeta. Para lograr esto hay que sostener el apoyo y aumentar la relevancia de las organizaciones multilaterales.
El G20 se autodefinió entonces, por decisión propia, como un mecanismo de coordinación económica. A diferencia del G7, que es un ámbito de países desarrollados, el G20 es más representativo de la realidad política internacional actual y puede desempeñar un papel importante para abordar una serie de desafíos globales, como quedó demostrado con la pandemia del COVID-19, el cambio climático, la crisis medioambiental y los efectos económicos derivados de la situación en Ucrania.
Its inception indicated that the G7 represented entirely by the developed world was actually insufficient in addressing cross-cutting global issues. It was imperative, therefore, to include middle and low-income countries and those with very systemic economic influence in the negotiations in order to find solutions which would be inclusive and effective.
The main difference between G7 and G20 is precisely the inclusion of emerging economies in a major leading platform of economic and financial cooperation. Unlike G7, which is a group of like-minded, similar advanced economies, G20 is a locus of a global dialogue of diverse countries. It's truly a pluralistic platform due to its diversity and its capacity to mobilize quickly and effectively.
Let me stress that coordination among EMEs is not forming a bloc versus our G7 partners, but to achieve a balance in G20 so that we could safeguard the interests of all G20 members. Our world is now faced with multiple challenges, including high inflation, food and energy crisis.
El G20 no está llamado a sustituir o renegociar compromisos asumidos en otros foros internacionales. Por el contrario, y para asegurar resultados, su objetivo es impulsarlos mediante una muestra de compromiso político para ejercer su mandato, para diseñar acciones concretas, para coordinarse. A lo largo de los años, su agenda se ha ampliado a otras cuestiones globales como el cambio climático, la crisis medioambiental, el comercio internacional, el empleo, el empoderamiento de la mujer, para mencionar solo algunos casos.
G20 has had a central role in conforming the international agenda. Today, G20 is the premier forum of economic cooperation, development dialogue. The most recent example of G20 ability to act swiftly has been the response during the pandemic, in which G20 took actions both to help the development and deployment of vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics, such as the ACT acceleration, and also to address the economic downturn caused by the pandemic and a series of crises, security and food crisis, for instance.
Shortly after the COVID-19 outbreak, EMEs pushed for G20 collective actions to catalyze global pandemic response. EMEs stand for development and progress. In G20, we always prioritize global development, inclusive growth, and global economic governance. Because of G20 process, the voting power of developing countries in the IMF and World Bank increased by 6 and 3.7 percentage points, respectively. EMEs stand by fairness and justice. To accommodate the concerns of EMEs, G20 agenda setting and decision-making are based on consensus rather than domination by a single country or group.
Firstly, the EMEs, the emerging market economies, are significant players in the global economy. Looking at the data from the period of 2011 to 2021, the EMEs' share of global GDP amounted to approximately 49.5%, with its share of global GDP growth reaching 67.3% globally. Now, since 2000, the MECs had recorded remarkable growth rates while keeping inflation and other potential problems largely under control. Even during the crisis of the global recession of 2007-2008, the emerging market economies bounced back and recovered better and faster than advanced economies. And they continue to play a big role in driving and affecting the global economy.
So you had an approach to crisis that ensured that the recovery is sustainable and also is broadly shared, and some countries don't recover at the expense of others. And you have cooperation between developing and developed country central banks in a way that you would not have had in the past. So in that sense, I would say emerging markets shape the agenda. If you look at another hot topic, climate change, we've been very clear that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities has to be reinforced and also backed by practical action. So commitments, for instance, to climate finance by the rich countries who are responsible for pollution, the G20 and the emerging markets within the G20 have been quite vocal in reminding the world of that obligation and also tracking to what extent that obligation has been met.
Con frecuencia se han citado los cambios en la estructura de la economía mundial y en ese sentido las cumbres del G20 se han visto como una oportunidad de reflejar una visión menos centrada en los países desarrollados, incorporando la visión de los países emergentes en un foro que supera en número al G7. Por otro lado, algunas opiniones han sostenido que la ventaja numérica o el cambio de retórica hacia los países emergentes no reflejan la realidad y que la agenda del G20 sigue dominada por las preferencias del G7, otorgándole una base más amplia de legitimidad y apoyo.
But even when emerging market economies were formally at the G20 table, the menu, that is the G20 agenda, was still to a large extent designed in the way that did not reflect our interests and priorities on quite a number of issues, from reform of global governance institutions to climate and development agenda.
The leadership of emerging countries can contribute to achieving a better balance between the priorities of developed and developing countries. In previous years, there was a perception of predominance of major powers' agenda in the discussion. Unfortunately, the consequences of the pandemic and the current geopolitical tensions have had an important impact on multiple sectors. This crisis will continue damaging the progress of our development goals with long-lasting effects on the most vulnerable people.
Las economías emergentes han tenido ciertas dificultades a la hora de imponer agenda. Esto se suma al difícil panorama que se aproxima. El propio Banco Mundial advirtió recientemente sobre este preocupante escenario de crisis superpuestas que implican dos grandes reveses: un paso atrás en la reducción de la pobreza global después de 3 décadas y una aceleración de las desigualdades.
To say we are falling behind on the Sustainable Development Goals, on the 2030 agenda. We're not on track to meet most of those. Obviously, we can see challenges to food security. We can see challenges to access to energy. We see women have fallen behind in labor markets during the pandemic. So there's so many items on the SDG where we went with it with a lot of ambition, but now we have to make sure that we get back on track.
Much has been done over the past 14 years. Emerging market economies initiated the reform of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But while their quotas and voices have been eventually reviewed, the quota formula and the governance system of both organizations in general still deserve further reform. The G20 finance, development, climate and trade agenda has long been dominated by developed countries' approaches and needs, and it is the only in recent years, couple of years, that we have achieved a true balance of views in the G20 leaders' declarations. The Bali summit demonstrated that it is the emerging market economies who take a lead and safeguard the G20's role of a premier forum for international economic cooperation.
El G20 corre el riesgo de perder relevancia como institución principalmente financiera, considerando que la mayoría de los temas dominantes hoy se centran en la geopolítica y la seguridad. Además, está surgiendo una brecha en la gobernanza global y la provisión de bienes públicos, dado que las grandes potencias están consumidas por la rivalidad geopolítica. La pandemia de COVID-19 y ahora el conflicto en Ucrania han infundido una sensación de desesperanza, en gran parte debido al desgaste y a la ausencia de solidaridad internacional. De igual forma, los organismos multilaterales han brillado especialmente por una falta de respuesta adecuada.
As recently demonstrated by positive outcomes of the Bali summit last November, the role of emerging countries was key to reducing geopolitical tensions between big powers. Our commitment to international peace, stability and prosperity has been confirmed with the adoption of a sound and robust G20 leaders declaration. Diplomacy and dialogue must always prevail.
In this context, we hope that EMEs will stand together and work together for a stronger G20, for more inclusive and world economic recovery and sustainable development.
Hasta aquí, la agenda del G20 se ha centrado principalmente en los problemas del mundo desarrollado, más que en los desafíos específicos y urgentes de las economías emergentes y los países en desarrollo. Sin embargo, en los próximos años, las sucesivas presidencias de India, Brasil y Sudáfrica pueden impulsar una nueva perspectiva que evite que la agenda de este foro internacional quede reducida a un mero reciclado de la que lleva el G7.
The Troika, followed by the South African presidency, will provide G20 the unique opportunity to look at development from the perspective of the developing countries whose share in global market is growing and expanding. And that would turn the tables in many ways so that we can have a very fruitful discussion on issues concerning both the developed and the developing world.
Having the presidencies being held by the emerging market economies clearly means that we are able to set the agenda for the work and priorities of the G20, especially in support of the developing countries. You can see this clearly reflected in our team, the Indonesian presidency team and priorities which we have set out, which is recover together, recover stronger.
To achieve these goals, emerging market economies must not only voice their views, but be active and persistent in promoting them. It means to be at every table and form the menu ourselves. It also means to bear responsibility for those emerging market economies and developing countries who are not at the G20 table, to involve them in G20 work, to get engaged with them.
I take great courage from the fact that India has invited Nigeria, Egypt, Mauritius, might be missing, and obviously Bangladesh and others outside the African continent. But just when we look at the African invitees, we're seeing a greater voice for the continent in the G20, which has also been an important issue for us as South Africa, that we don't want to be the only ones around the table.
When India takes over the presidency, it is not speaking the voice of India alone. It's speaking the voice of the Troika, it's speaking the voice of the emerging markets. It's speaking the voice of also the global South. The emerging economies leading the multilateral forums actually allows us to make a case for global South-sensitive globalization. It is a model of globalization that shifts from a self-centered to a human-centric approach.
The Brazil G20 presidency in 2024, starting December 2023, will be an opportunity to bring to the center of the agenda areas that are important to us, such as sustainable development, energy, climate, social inclusion, and sustainable infrastructure.
Entonces, la troika que se aproxima abre una continuidad sin precedentes de países emergentes al frente del foro que podría, por fin, desplazar la atención mundial hacia las necesidades de los países del sur global. Con ello, daremos un gran paso para generar consensos y afrontar las diferentes problemáticas que nos esperan en este mundo tan incierto.